A few miles north of Stirling lies the remains of one of the great treasures of Roman Scotland. A defensive outpost, beautifully preserved on a windswept moor, boasting centuries of history. This is Ardoch Roman Fort. In this short documentary, we're going to delve into the history of this stunning site.
Ardoch is a Roman fort in central Scotland in Perthshire, and it's one of the best surviving examples of its type anywhere in the Roman Empire. As you can see from the massive ramparts and ditches around its perimeter, it really survives in really good quality condition. It was first built in the 1st century AD when the Roman armies were actually intent on conquering the whole of Scotland and actually coming through that area.
The area around Ardoch Fort is a key area in the Roman period throughout the Roman invasions, and we have 3 of those in Scotland. They're building one big fort, and there are a series of camps. Now, we're not too sure on the dating of the camps, but there will be some camps built in the 1st century when Agricola was active.
In terms of Agricola's campaigns, we're fairly confident that it was occupied at the same time as his campaigns. Whether it was him that actually founded it, we don't have an exact foundation date. Some forts, you're lucky enough to find something that actually gives you a date, like a coin hoard or something that actually has the latest date, which at least helps you to do that. We don't have that evidence for Ardoch, but we do have plenty of evidence shown that it was occupied in the 80s AD, so very much contemporary with Agricola's campaigns, and would have been occupied when he was operating in Scotland.
And the remains of the Flavian fort here can be seen. It's very extensive, the far reaches of the ditches visible to this day here. But Ardoch is a fascinating site because it doesn't just have the remains of a Flavian fort. Closer in, and it almost from the aerial photography shows it, the fort has shrunk a little because that is a later Antonine fort. The Antonine meaning the period in the mid to late 2nd century AD.
So they came back in the 2nd century, in the Antonine period, when the Antonine Wall was built, and it had a different function at that point, because in the 1st century it was a fort when they were planning on conquering the whole of Scotland. That was very much in their mindset, whereas in the 2nd century the line had been drawn across central Scotland between the Forth and the Clyde isthmuses, and it's an outpost fort to the north, sort of controlling that area north of the wall.
And it's not just that, there's also a belief that there was perhaps a 3rd fort constructed here too, although that is hotly debated.
In the Severing campaigns, when they come along, they don't seem to occupy the fort, but they occupy the camps, and that's because they're on a temporary mission to try and quell some of the issues that they're having further north from that period.
We have quite a lot of archaeology. It was a very pioneering excavation from its time because it was dug at the very end of the 19th century, and it was really one of the first times when they started recognising timber archaeology in the remains of timber forts. So it's at that point, and there has been other pieces of work on it since, including geophysical survey, but we know we have that 1st century Flavian fort and then also a 2nd century fort, reusing and changing the perimeter slightly. One of the reasons it has so many ditches is because of the length of occupation and multiple uses.
These ditches are about 6 foot deep. It's astonishing. Steep to climb up the sides today. And then just over there at the entrance to the fort itself, you can see some of the best preserved earthworks from Roman Britain, surviving to this day. Absolutely astonishing.
The ditches of the fort of Ardoch were excavated in the late 19th century, so we've got some really good profiles and we've got some fantastic photographs of those excavations, of people really deep down, and a level of health and safety that they wouldn't get away with today. And obviously sometimes nowadays, if it was excavated, we would actually look much more at the deposits in the ditch and we would throw an awful lot more scientific analysis at it than was available in 1896 and 1897. But it has given us a profile, it's given us a sequencing between the ditches that helps us to then say, right, we think these ditches here go with the fort in the 1st century, and we think these ditches here go with the fort in the 2nd century. Ardoch Roman Fort itself would probably have had some kind of sort of timber structure on top of the ramparts. And then you've got to imagine a succession of timber buildings in the interior, barrack blocks for the soldiers, the central headquarters building, the commanding officer's house and all that kind of thing.
Now, at the heart of Ardoch Roman Fort, we see this feature surviving. So you might think perhaps it's something Roman. Well, you've been mistaken. This feature is all that remains of a much later structure, a medieval chapel constructed centuries after the Romans left. Interestingly enough, at the end of the 19th century, an excavation was done here which established the site layout of the fort. And the Principia, the actual headquarters building, was located over there. And you can imagine, just looking at the size of the remains that we can see today, the ditches, how much effort there must have been to build those ditches, layers upon layers of them. Also the walls themselves, constructing the fortifications. Inside the fort, you can imagine lots of Roman soldiers, auxiliary soldiers all about the place.
Obviously, when you visit Ardoch today, it seems quite quiet and peaceful, the wind blowing across a relatively empty field. You get to the ramparts and then you get an idea of the majesty. But what that does is hide the hive of activity that you'd have had going on there. You would have had these wooden barrack blocks, you would have had the headquarters building. You've got to imagine the noise of hundreds of men. You'd have had soldiers on guard at night time, and you've really got to imagine something that's quite busy. And often it's good to actually have a think about when you've watched some film or a television programme that's actually shown the Roman army, the battle scene at the beginning of Gladiator when they all come back and they're in the camp afterwards. And it shows you an image of something that's really quite dirty and smelly. And I think you've got to conjure up, this isn't this lovely windswept moor. This was a busy, active place full of soldiers. On the area to the north in particular, there are a huge number of marching camps that have been recorded. There's upstanding bits of 2 of them, but otherwise a lot of it is only shown in crop markings from the air, so it's where the grass grows or the crops grow differently, and you can see that particularly from an aerial viewpoint. These are also vast. One of the camps that we have a surviving stretch of in the woodland there and that you can see as crop marks for other bits of its perimeter is about 130 acres in size. It's huge. We've also got on the east side of that camp sits over a watchtower which has also been excavated, and that's 1st century in date, again going with those 1st century Flavian Agricolan campaigns in Scotland. But the camp goes on top of it, so we think that camp's significantly later, and that's possibly the Severan campaigns. So that camp is quite probably 130 years later than the watchtower it sits on top of.
Now Ardoch, it occupied a very strong position. It had commanding views, particularly to the south. It also made use of the adjacent river valley.
Well, we've got a Roman road running north and it's got a series of watchtowers on it, and there's further forts going north from Ardoch, again the 1st century, and some of which were also occupied in the 2nd century.
It's on the route into the Highlands. Just slightly north of that we seem to get a fortified signalling chain. Ardoch has a key role in that. It is pivotal, it is controlling activity in this area.
So we have this kind of line of communication, this frontier road running through Perthshire that is in effect a fortified road, and it's similar to what you get elsewhere in the empire. This idea of a road which is watched over by a number of towers is really quite common in other parts of the empire. So we have got an awful lot of coming and going, and we've got the evidence of that, and Ardoch's one of the best places in Britain to see that.
Ardoch is almost multi-layered. It's a fascinating site to visit and to learn more about the Roman army in Scotland.
Welcome to the History Hit YouTube channel, which we are relaunching. We've got all the best exclusive content going straight onto this History Hit YouTube channel. And you can find out, for example, why on earth I'm standing at the top of this mast. You should probably subscribe.